How to be a genius, master everything 3. Hi, in this video we'll apply the notes concept in a book, and of course we will go a little bit deeper. The book we shall be using is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So we'll apply this concept in the first chapter of this book. Note that as we read through the chapter, we shall be marking notes with a red color. Amazon Amy will be reading for us.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park has let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it, that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. What is his name?" "Bingley. Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls." "How so? How can it affect them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." "Is that his design in settling here?" "Design? Nonsense, how can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley may like you the best of the party." "My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you. And I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humored as Lydia. But you are always giving her the preference." "They have none of them much to recommend them," replied he. "They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion for my poor nerves." "You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these last 20 years at least. Ah, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it, and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us, if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all." Mr. Bennet was sought a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married, its solace was visiting and news.
If you don't know anything about the notes concept, please start at the description. There is a link that will take you to a short course. It will teach you about notes and how to use them. Thereafter, you will come back here, you will understand what we are doing. And don't worry, it's a short course and it's free. As you noticed, while she was reading, we were highlighting the important notes with a red color. So the next step now is to extract them, take them out of the text and put them aside. So here are the notes that we took from the story. We've got Nia Netherfield, we've got Mrs. Bennet. So what we did, just to save time, we listed notes that are under Mrs. Bennet and other notes that are under Mr. Bennet. Why? Because it was obvious to see the main entities in the chapter. So to save time, we just listed the notes under each main entity. So under Mrs. Bennet, we've got Netherfield Park, we've got Mrs. Long, we've got Bingley, we've got North England, we've got Mr. Morris, we've got our girls, we've got Sir William and Lady Lucas, we've got Lizzie. We also have got Jane and Lydia. And then, under Mr. Bennet, we've got Mr. Bingley and Lizzie. Now that we have these notes perfectly laid out on a paper, we have to put some little notes on each one. Just some little notes. What you remember from your mind. You don't look at the text now, you're writing from your head. So you give those brain muscles some little exercise. You are writing from your head now. Just a little bit of what you remember. This is what we have. Mrs. Bennet, this is what we have about her. It's Mr. Bennet's wife. It's obvious, you just remember that easily. She was described as a person with little understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. Netherfield Park, what do you remember about Netherfield Park? It's the park which was bought or was listed to Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Long, it's a friend of Mrs. Bennet, brought all gossip to Mrs. Bennet. It's the lady who would come for gossip with her. Bingley bought the park. North England, where Mr. Bingley came from. Mr. Morris, it's the park owner. Our girls is the 5 girls. Sir William and Lady Lucas, determined to visit Mr. Bingley for their daughter's sake. Lizzie, one of the girls. Jane, according to Mrs. Bennet, Jane is more beautiful than Lizzie. According to Mrs. Bennet, Lydia is good-humored than Lizzie. Then now, coming to Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet is Mrs. Bennet is happy, complex character, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice. Notes under Mr. Bennet is Mr. Bingley. According to Mr. Bennet, Bingley must marry Lizzie. Then Lizzie, according to Mr. Bennet, it's his favorite child. She has some more quickness to her, according to Mr. Bennet. So all of these notes, you are just writing their notes. But what you realize is that as you write notes under each note, first of all, it's very easy to remember the information related to each note. That's first and foremost. It's very easy to remember. For example, if I say Bingley, quickly you just know that is the guy who bought or was was list the park easily. If I say Mr. Morris, you know that it's the park owner who leased this park to Mr. Bingley. If I say Mrs. Long, easily you recall that Mrs. Long is the gossiper who comes to gossip with Mrs. Bennet. Easily. Because you are using these notes which your mind wants. After you have written the notes under each note, you will realize that the notes, they bring back the whole story to you easily. So because of the notes, you remember just everything. Everything in the story, everything easily. If you like, you could also use what we call information unit diagrams, where you put these things in diagram form. This is the setting where everything happens. The setting, we labeled it as Neanderthal. We use Neanderthal because in the chapter, we were not yet given the name of the place where they are at. It's given in later chapters of the book. So we just used in Neanderthal. So this is the setting. Then we've got the first entity. What is her name? It's Mrs. Bennet. We've got the second entity. His name is Mr. Bennet. Then these two entities are the main entities in the story. What are the notes under each entity? Netherfield Park is the first thing that was on her mind when she was talking to Mr. Bennet. Mrs. Long, her friend, they gossip together. Mr. Bingley, the one, she wants him to marry one of their daughters. North England, where Bingley comes from. Mr. Morris, the owner of the park. Our girls, their children. Lady Lucas are competitors. They also want their daughters to be married to this man. Lizzie, one of the children. The one she considers beautiful. The one she considers more human. Mr. Bingley, according to Mr. Bennet, should marry Lizzie. Lizzie is his favorite child. So basically we've got the whole story carried by the knots. That's the gist of this concept. The whole story carried by the knots. So your strategy is to understand that you pick the knots, you master the knots, and by mastering the knots, you have mastered everything that you went through in the story, or in the event, or in the concept, whatever you were reading. Because as I said earlier, this does not only apply to narrative literature, it also applies to conceptual literature like mathematics, programming, chemistry, biology, whatever it may be, accounting, whatever it may be, finance, whatever it may be, this concept applies in every field. I hope you still remember this chunk. We called it a chunk in the previous lesson. So as we were reading, this is what we had in our current memory. We had this chunk in our current memory as we were reading the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice. We had this, and if we were content that we have finished the book because we only had this, after say some 2 weeks, we wouldn't remember what the chapter was about. But now, since we have created notes, we will remember as much as we want. We've got control of our long-term memory in saving this information, in storing this information. We've got control of it. So this affirms what I said earlier in another video, that the mind hates text, blocks of text. It loves structure. So this is what we have in our minds concerning this chapter. This is Mrs. Bennet, this is Mr. Bennet, and our minds enjoys this a lot. That's why it will service you very well if you want to recall what you were reading. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, to share, and subscribe so you don't miss out when we teach you how to apply this concept in other types of information in other subjects, in mathematics, in history, in accounting, in finance, in chemistry, in biology, in whatever, in physics, in programming. We will be showing you practically how to apply this concept. So please subscribe. In the comments, please tell us where you will be trying this concept, what book you will be applying it on.